Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Wednesday lunch here at the Divinity School. I'm Karen Wise, I'm the Director of Communication here. I organize the Wednesday lunch series, so it's a pleasure to see so many of you here today. Before we get started with the program, I want to do our usual housekeeping. I want to thank our chefs Casey and Alex and the crew for today's delicious meal. Now, they do all the shopping and the cooking right here in our little kitchen from scratch. So you really have to appreciate what they've given you. And also on your way out, please bus your own station because they cook, they shouldn't have to clean. So throw out your garbage on your way out. We have a yellow silky bag for your silverware, and we have a big, what do you call that thing? Silver tray. Thank you. Tray for your mugs and cups. If you are looking for sugar or creamer, I can pass them around, or I'll bring them back. Maybe we'll just put them on this table. If you don't want them, you can keep passing them. And also, if you can turn off your cell phones, if you want to bring them before we start, that would be great. Are there any community announcements today?
The lecture that was listed by Professor Marshall Salas for tomorrow, May 12th, will be rescheduled for later this month due to unanticipated minor surgery. Professor Salas says he's doing very well, but he was debating whether a COVID-induced lecture would be added. He decided it would not be. So we should have an announcement on Thursday to indicate that. And he's promised to execute the parody of the drawing in Houses of Violin, so I encourage you not.
Anyone else? Announcements? Okay, well then I'm just going to turn it over to Dean Rosenberg, because we always seem to need all the time we have. So if you could welcome Dean Rosenberg today, he's going to introduce our panel speaker.
Wherever you want to sit. It sure is good to be up here with all these philosophers. It's said that one of the great things about standing still long enough is you become a trend. And while I haven't found that to be true in my time at the Divinity School, one thing that is true about it is that you get to watch the morphing of intellectual work here. And one of the things we have represented at what I believe is the 45th Dean's Forum in the history of the institution, this is the 15th year and we have one per quarter, is in fact the development of the philosophy of religions as a field of study here. While I would defer to my learned colleagues about what that means, it seems, from my point of view at least, to mean at least two things. One of which is that the Divinity School has tried to introduce the notion that one can do the philosophy of religion in a properly comparative way, an endeavor that is represented by Professor Dan Arnold, who is one of our first respondents, in the sense that what properly comparative seems to me is the insistence that the classic canon in philosophy of religion is not only the texts of the Western tradition, but the texts of other traditions, so-called Eastern and whatnot, and the notion that one can not only recuperate the deeply philosophical work in those traditions, but insist that they are in profound dialogue with the classic canonical progenitors of the West. The other thing it seems to me is to bring into greater relief than was previously the case the close connections, and to pursue them in a principled way, between philosophical and theological thought. And that work seems to me to be well represented both by the book we are discussing today, by Professor Coyne, and by Professor Coyne's work, and by the work of Professor Marion, who is the second respondent. So it's a great opportunity to celebrate first Professor Coyne's achievement in Heidegger's Confessions, and secondly to enjoy in that context, its context in the doing of the philosophy of religions at the University of Chicago Divinity School. So it's a delight to welcome Professor Dan Arnold, Professor Jean-Luc Marion, and especially Professor Ryan Coyne. Professor Arnold and then Professor Marion will offer some comments on the book. Professor Coyne will then have the opportunity to respond to it. I thought it was a collegial nod of high order that Professor Coyne said that he felt his book would be accurately represented by his respondents, and that he didn't need to introduce it first, and then we will open up the floor for whatever time we have for discussion. So I want to thank my colleagues and turn the floor over to them. So welcome.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for the invitation to respond to this book and for providing the occasion to reread a book that I had first read in manuscript. It's a pleasure to do so. And congratulations, Ryan, on a really outstanding book. This is an outstanding book. It's really fantastic on many levels. I don't know if the title was actually mentioned, but I should get the title before going any further. It's Heidegger's Confessions, The Remains of Saint Augustine in Being and Time and Beyond. And one of the most extraordinary things about this book is the really vast erudition it reflects. Ryan, it's clear, has read staggering amounts of Heidegger and Heidegger scholarship, but no less impressively and deeply in the history of Christian thought as well. So the range of thinkers and languages and presuppositions necessary to engage in thinking about Heidegger and Augustine independently and in conversation with each other is truly impressive. Also really striking and impressive about this book is the way that Ryan has of engaging with Heidegger. So he is steeped in the Heidegger corpus to an extent that would make medieval scholiasts nod with approval, a really deep control of this. But there are way too many people, including scholars of Heidegger, for whom understanding Heidegger seems to consist simply in learning to talk like Heidegger, which I seldom find helpful. And this is a really lucidly written and incisive book that, among other things, makes a lot of Heidegger's project accessible to an Anglophone audience. And to any who doubt the accessibility of Heidegger to an Anglophone audience, any who doubt or the translatability of Heidegger into different mediums, I would commend a few other Anglophone moments in the reception of Heidegger. Gilbert Ryle's 1929 review of Simon Zeit, decades before it was translated into English, is a really outstanding essay by an Anglophone philosopher. And then more recently, Robert Grandin and John Hoagland are a couple of philosophers totally in an Anglophone tradition who made really productive and insightful use, I think, of Heidegger. And Ryan's book, with its clarity and rigor that are really characteristic, I think, of the Anglophone tradition, stands in the same lineage of modern recuperators. Though he's not so much a recuperator as a critic of Heidegger. I'll mention more in a second. Still more impressive even than the vast erudition of the book and than the skill at representing the eccentric idiom of Heidegger accessibly is that all of this stuff is in service of his development of a really broad and imaginative vision for philosophy of religion, more generally. So I think in this book we can see not just a profound and insightful study of Heidegger, but both an argument for and an exemplification of a distinctive vision of what philosophy of religion might mean. So to say a bit about that, I need first to say a little bit about the kind of engagement with Heidegger that we have in the book. I could start with the title, Heidegger's Confessions. I take it there's a double entendre there. The significance is to refer both to the role of Augustine's Confessions in the formation of Heidegger's thought, but also I take it to refer to the many ways in which Heidegger's corpus often sort of unwittingly confesses to the presence of Augustine in his work. So Ryan's interested not just in sort of studying the influence of Augustine, but studying the ways in which things borrowed from Augustine by Heidegger often work against Heidegger's own purposes. It's a very sophisticated and complex project here. In particular, Ryan's interested in Heidegger's project of detheologization, of taking historically freighted terms from the Christian tradition and stripping them of their theological significance and repurposing them to give expression to Heidegger's own philosophical project in fundamental ontology. So as Ryan puts it, Heidegger aimed to forge new concepts out of theological works in order to undo the adverse effects of secularization. One of the problems with Heidegger's proceeding this way is that he was taking historically freighted theological concepts from very specific traditions and trying to make them do duty as, and I quote Ryan, universally applicable concepts of lived temporality. So he was trying to repurpose these as philosophical concepts, as having universal applicability, as having significance for fundamental ontology, though they're taken from very specific traditions. Even more interestingly problematic is that these concepts seem to have lives and entailments of their own. And that, I take it, is what Ryan's book has done an especially good job of showing. The ways in which Heidegger's whole philosophical career, these crucial moments in it, can be understood in terms of his ongoing struggle to contain the fallout from concepts that are sometimes at cross purposes with the reasons for which he enlisted them. And one of the real virtues of the book is that in doing that, it provides what seems to me an uncommonly good account of the entire career of Heidegger. It makes sense in this way of later developments in Heidegger, as well as the Heidegger of being in time. But I confess I still don't understand the later Heidegger, not even a little. Just really briefly, a couple of examples of what this looks like in Ryan's book. He has a chapter, for example, on the significance of the Apostle Paul in Heidegger's thought, and that's based on a lot of spade work in the Heidegger archives and a close reading of 1920 and 21 seminar on Introduction to the Phenomenology of Religion, taught by Heidegger. And interestingly, commentary on some Pauline epistles figures really centrally in this seminar, ostensibly on phenomenology of religion. And Ryan does a good job of showing that what was most salient to Heidegger about these Pauline epistles is Paul's eschatological understanding of the second coming. So to Heidegger, what's significant is that Paul has a complete lack of concern with, and I quote, the question concerning when the parousia or second coming will actually occur. Heidegger takes it that Paul is instead properly concerned with the ontological significance of this idea, and not with its historically objective significance as a particular occasion. The chapter after that, the point that Ryan develops with reference to Paul in that regard is that Heidegger sees in Paul's sense of the ontological significance of the parousia something that informed Heidegger's later thought that it's a central characteristic of Dasein, or the distinctively human way of being, for it never to be whole, for it never to be complete, for it never to be ready to hand. So the suspension of waiting for the second coming, Heidegger took as guiding his idea that it's distinctive of the human way of being that we're always projects in process. And similarly, Ryan cogently shows in the chapter after that the sense it made for Heidegger to appropriate Augustine, particularly with respect to his attempt to undermine the Cartesian project. So for Heidegger, what's significant there is that in the Augustinian idea of confession, we have a way to appreciate that subjectivity is not, as it arguably was for Descartes, the locus of indubitable certainty, but rather the most authentic way in which subjectivity is in view is as a question. And Ryan shows something of Heidegger's debt to Augustine in considering it that way. All right, so he's interested in this level of archaeological and genealogical analysis of Heidegger's concepts. But the really significant thing here is that Heidegger can't always contain the significance of the concepts that he repurposes. And as I said, many developments in Heidegger's later thought can be seen, as Ryan shows them to be, in terms of Heidegger's doing damage control with respect to trains of thought that are led off track by forces often internal to the concepts. And one of the important differences this makes philosophically is that Ryan shows that many of the insights that Heidegger represents as yielded by phenomenological analysis can instead be traced to the history of concepts that he happens to have used. So it's not insignificant that these concepts that are repurposed as expressing a fundamental ontology, in fact, have very specifically Christian valences and resonances. What Ryan's doing in showing all this with respect to Heidegger is exemplifying Heidegger's own way of recuperating these traditions. He's exemplifying what Heidegger called destructive interpretation. And in Heidegger's hands, what that meant is that we should, and I'm quoting Ryan, use philosophical concepts cautiously with the intention of dissolving the concealments engendered by their history. And Heidegger's thought in doing that was that we could then reach, and quote again, the primordial experiences in which philosophical concepts first take shape and in which concealments first arise. So Heidegger's thought seems to have been that we can get behind or we can get to some place prior to the theologically traditionally specific content of these and identify the philosophical impulse they express. Ryan, in exemplifying the same sort of destructive interpretation, doesn't claim at all to be discovering primordial experiences. Instead, he's showing that, and here I quote from the introduction, that Heidegger's first way of building up the question of being was designed to keep at bay competing notions of human finitude that could just as easily be derived from its genealogical sources. So there's a specific decision made ahead of time to theorize human temporality in a way whose outcome is kind of already foreordained, and that against Heidegger's claim to be getting back behind these concepts and rediscovering their primordial significance. All right, so a word on the larger vision of philosophy of religion that's exemplified by this, because in reading Heidegger this way, Ryan is himself doing what he takes philosophy of religion to mean. And this against Heidegger's own claim that the very idea of philosophy of religion was an incoherent idea, that this is an oxymoron. So for Ryan, what the philosophy of religion can or should consist in, at least among other things, is just this sort of analysis of a thinker's ongoing debt to religious concepts, even as that thinker is developing a project that's critical of religion. So, as Ryan says, and take this as a sort of programmatic statement of philosophy of religion, it's possible to define this field of inquiry as the critical examination of the historically conditioned and highly regulated sets of statements and rhetorical strategies that allow modern thinkers to separate themselves from imaginatively constructed religious traditions, while nevertheless continuing to draw upon the resources of these traditions in novel ways. The philosophy of religion is the discourse that examines how these processes of separation and dependence play out over time. So we have exemplified in the reading of Heidegger an example of a pretty clearly conceived and interesting vision of philosophy of religion. One according to which, interestingly, philosophy of religion maybe comes rather nearer to the kind of ideological critique that I think of as more characteristic of a project like Bruce Lincoln's, for example. And this seems to be a compelling and important vision for philosophy of religion. What interests me most, and here I'll offer two lines of concluding comment or question. What interests me most about the about Ryan's angle on the life of Augustinian concepts in the project of Heidegger. And we brought out by lingering on a couple of recurrent formulations of this. Let me just read a couple of passages in which Ryan expresses his idea of the significance of Augustine's presence. Ryan says that the goal of the study is, quote, not to compare in depth the works of Heidegger and Augustine, but rather to analyze Heidegger's own portrayal of Augustinian concepts, what they contributed to his philosophical formation, the tensions they generated in his work. And again, he writes that Heidegger's conceptual indebtedness to Augustine and to the Pauline epistles generated a hidden tension in his early writings that eventually influenced the composition and execution of Being and Time. He generated this by using terms that are both laden with theological meaning. And then apropos of the seminar on Paul, he says that the commentary on 1 and 2 Thessalonians generates a hidden dilemma in Heidegger's work that never got resolved. And what especially interests me in this book is the idea of concepts as generating tensions in this way. Seems to be one of the interesting takeaways from this is some illuminating lessons about the objectivity of concepts, of conceptual content. And so one of my questions is, I wonder what Ryan might say by way of elaborating on the objectivity of concepts as they figure in here. So what are the processes or mechanisms by which these appropriated concepts exert pressure on Heidegger's thought? What kinds of pressure do these concepts exert on thought? How is a philosopher's project bent in directions that are unanticipated and unwilled as a function of the entailments of concepts that are borrowed from elsewhere? And there are a couple of ways I can imagine going in talking about this, in talking about the objectivity of conceptual content. One way is to make the point that it's characteristic of concepts to have entailments, to be inferentially related to other concepts. If you have the concept of being blue, then you also ipso facto have the concept of being a color. And there's an inferential relation between those. And it's in the nature of conceptual thought in general that the things we claim and believe have consequences and entailments. And one of the things that we're doing in doing philosophy is thinking systematically about what else is entailed by our commitments. And this is a way to express a point that philosophers of hermeneutics were apt to emphasize, namely the idea of a surplus of meaning. The idea of consequences, of entailments of concepts as objectively having their own content independent of what we take them to mean, is a good way to make sense of why it says we should expect that all texts are characterized by a surplus of meaning. Why an author is never a privileged interpreter of his or her own text. Why? Well, because nobody can possibly be aware of everything that's entailed by what they say. It's the process of generations of thought and commentary and debate to figure out what all follows from anybody's particular account. So that's one way of talking about the objectivity of conceptual content, right? Talking about the idea that it's not just up to us what we mean by what we say. It's not up to us what's entailed by our commitments and our concepts. There are cases where it makes sense to say you're wrong about what you mean by your claim because you failed to consider X, Y, or Z. So that would be one way of talking about the objectivity of conceptual content as something that figures importantly in this book. Another way I can imagine going is to think that something about Ryan's method here vindicates something important about Heidegger. So this is largely critical of Heidegger in important ways, but I wonder if the organizing wager here, the idea that we can trace in Heidegger's thought the work done by concepts he appropriates, shows Heidegger right in thinking that phenomenology must finally be hermeneutic, that it's something about the historicity of human being is evident in the life of concepts, and that though Heidegger erred in thinking that he had discovered universal philosophical truths, he was himself exemplifying something significant about human understanding. Okay, so that's one line of question. What sense would you make, or what more might you say about the objectivity of concepts? The second one, and this is brief, is I wonder, apropos of Ryan's thought that Heidegger deliberately entrained certain concepts so as to foreclose other possible understandings of human temporality. I wonder what an example would be of an alternative understanding of temporality, something alternative to what Heidegger came up with in thrall as he was to Augustine's concepts. And given the point that's been made about historicity, if there is an alternative account here, on what grounds could it be judged preferable? Or would any alternative admit of the same kind of analysis that's given of Heidegger? So those are my questions and comments about a really extraordinary book that I recommend to everybody.
I would like to say a lot of things, but to make a long story short, I disagree with you on a very important point. I'm not certain that we discuss the topic of your PhD at the crossing of Dorchester and 57. I think it was downtown, you know, the river. That's it is on that point that we disagree really. For the rest, we don't. What's important in this first book by Ryan is not only that it is the first of a long series, I think we know that for a long time, but that this is a very important moment in the interpretation of Heidegger. May I insist on the fact that we only now start to read Heidegger correctly, for a very good reason. It's only now that we have the Gesamtausgabe, and so the opportunity to have the whole thing in front of us, as intended by Heidegger, with the shortcomings in life. But this is very important because there is a history of the interpretation and reception of Heidegger, which was only a history made with partial moments and with a lot of voluntary and involuntary dissimulations. Now, this is a different situation. And in that new situation, that is, we have access to the whole thing, including the Schwarzenhefte, and with in fact, Heidegger was fair. He has said everything is there now. It's up to us to read it or not, to understand it or not, to criticize it, and so on. But nothing is hidden. And in that context, one of the most important issues is to understand the beginning of Heidegger. So the beginning of Heidegger is not Aristotle, it is not a question of being, it is first indeed what was known under the title of the hermeneutic of facticity in the early 20s. But this hermeneutic of facticity, which was explained that way, under that title, in fact means a debate with Christianity, with Paul and Augustine. So this aspect of Heidegger was in fact erased and unknown or erased by the first two generations of Heideggerian commentators. And for instance, when I was trained by Jean-Luc, who was a close friend to Heidegger, nothing was said about that. It was the hidden part of Heidegger. He should not have been interested in that. And after the publication of the early volumes of the Gesamtausgabe, the question was opened. So we have had, for instance, in France, a book by Christian Sommer on Luther and in the early thought of Heidegger. And this time, I think it is the first time, we have the same book, the same study about the relation of Heidegger to Augustine. And this time it is done on the other side of the Atlantic, and it was not done in Europe before. And so this is not America catching up, it is America leading the research with the book of by Ryan. So this is a very important book in the development of the interpretation of Heidegger. So this being said, Ryan made a very strong point by asking a textual question, which is very wise and very tricky, I would say. We all know, this is well known, that in 1921, Augustine gave, as a young assistant, yes, not TA, but not yet assistant professor, assistant of Husserl, a seminar on Augustinus und der Neoplatonismus, which was published in the volume of the Gesamtausgabe called Phenomenology of Religious Life, volume 16. So the standard view was up to Ryan to say, well, he paid attention to Paul, he paid attention to Augustine, and then, so he built up the hermeneutic of facticity, and then he used that to reopen the question of being by shifting to Aristotle. This was a common received view, and it was mine. And Ryan pointed out that this is not that simple. That is, because in 1930, when Heidegger was at that time a full professor in Marburg, the official successor of Husserl, who will soon be. So when Heidegger was now not in Marburg anymore, in Freiburg back, so it is 9 years later, after being in time, after Basis Metaphysics, that he gave another seminar on Augustine, on Book 11, on time. And this twice, once in the Abbey of Beuron, private lecture, among for a public and for believers, the monks and people attending the Abbey of Beuron, and after that, during his winter seminar, or the summer seminar. So there is a second lecture, a second pass, as Ryan put it, a second pass through the confession. So Ryan very wisely asked the question, why this coming back to Augustine? So there is a long inquiry, but what is very clear is this. You cannot escape your beginnings. You cannot escape Augustine. When you start with theology, you cannot escape completely from theology. You have to do that, at least if you want to erase your origin, you have to do that many times, because the origin are coming back. And there is, after that, a second discovery made. It is not a discovery, it is well known, but we have not taken seriously, by Ryan, that in 1946, when Heidegger wrote this very strange, brilliant, but very strange text on the first sentence ever written, at least this is the legend, by a philosopher, the Spruch Anaximander, the first words by Anaximander. So in 1946 we have this seminar and this text. You have both the seminar and the text. At the end of this very strange text on a very strange sentence, Heidegger comes to the conclusion that everything is about to creo, der Brauch, the way of using the beings in order to relate them to the being which is at the same moment disappearing. And strangely enough, at that moment, he translates to creo, der Brauch, as fruit, which is the arc Augustinian concept to describe the union in love with God. So how could we imagine that after phenomenology being methodological anatheism, after being in time, after the turn, after the deconstruction according to Nietzsche of all the metaphysical Christian tradition, at that moment, when he's starting his last journey in the difficult last Heidegger, at that moment he's back to Augustine and to the core of Augustine, because the doctrine of uti frui, we all agree about that, means really because why uti is to use something. And this should have been the translation of Brauch, of Socreon. In the distinction uti frui, uti is to use, and for Augustine, when you use something, you don't love that thing for itself. So when you love the thing for itself, you don't use it. You enjoy it fully. And it's why we have to use everything and enjoy only God. So to enjoy free means that you are still connected, you are in presence and in standing, remaining presence of something, which in fact is possible only with God, according to Augustine. So what is very strange in this last move is that between the two concepts go together for Augustine, uti and fui, to translate, to use Brauch, is using precisely the other one, fui. And second, fui means something, we understand why, for Augustine, fui is a way to keep the presence of God always in your mind and be united to God. So this is the point, not God, but the presence implied. So it's why Heidegger has privilege against the obvious meaning of the term, frui against uti. But at that moment you say, in that case, the last Heidegger is himself rooted openly and expressly by Heidegger into Augustine again. What does that mean? In fact, we don't know. What we know for sure is that Ryan has made a very important point, and the methodological question he asked, what does that mean to de-theologize a concept? Is crucial. This expression was used by Heidegger, rarely in fact, but there is a text, what is well known in section 10 of Being in Time about anthropology, where he used that. He says that we can theologize the concept, but nevertheless, take the example of transcendence, they remain rooted in theology, although they are not ontological. So what does that mean, this theologisierung? The answer is that at least there is two meanings, it's explained by Ryan, and there are two meanings in opposite, which are opposing, contradicting one each other. It can be to use theological concept to deconstruct the classical metaphysics, or to use theological concept out of their roots, theological roots, to continue the laicization of metaphysics. And those two meanings are in a position and to de-theologize a concept means either to criticize it in the line of enlightenment and use it without theology, or the exact reverse, that is to use this not to build up a systematic theology, but to criticize modernity, metaphysics, enlightenment, and so on. And the two are, in fact, utilised by Heidegger. Conclusion. We have now a new way to read Heidegger, and it is so much in line with my own attempt with God without being that I cannot be too positive and too grateful to Ryan for having done his work. And the second question is, this makes very clear that the relation between theology and philosophy is a cross relation. It is not philosophy which is making sense out of theology in a way or another. It is also theology which is theology is the most critical science. No one is more critical than theology, because it can speak in the name of the absolute, which is very dangerous indeed, but very efficient. And it is exactly what happened to Heidegger. What can resist a bold attempt as that of Heidegger? Only theologians. Only theologians are strong enough to say yes or no, and to compel Heidegger to come to terms with them at the very end, which is exactly the situation, the issue you have opened. And again, I thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. I would very much like to begin, it's a pleasure actually to begin by acknowledging my indebtedness and saying a few words of gratitude to everybody here. Thank you all for coming. It's so nice to be able to discuss this book among friends in a place that's very dear to my heart. But also to discuss it with three people to whom I owe so much. From conversations that I had with Dean Rosengarten going back many years now, and also conversations I've had over the past couple of years with Professor Arnold in various settings, and Professor Marion. I also should begin with something of a small defense on my part. While it is true that we first spoke about this project downtown, I'm referring to a moment at the end of the evening where you pointed out the momentousness of the occasion, and I've kept that in my heart ever since. I often think about something that Emmanuel Levinas has said about Heidegger, which is that on the one hand, Heidegger is an obligatory passage. There's no way around him. And on the other hand, one comes to regret what one owes to such a person, who is clearly a genius, had made so many poor political choices in his life. And it's nice to say that I don't at all regret my debt, the debt I owe to so many in this room. So it's nice to say that, and also to see that on this occasion, that when one sends a book out into the world, I think, but at least on my experience is that one wants to run for cover. You don't want to think about how it's being read. You don't want to think about what kind of impact it's having. But it's I feel very grateful for the fact that I feel like I've been so well read. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time passing at the moment. It's 10 after 1. I recognize that some of you may need to go. So let me say something brief in response to these very rich comments today. Dan said at the outset of his remarks that I'm sort of steeped, as it were, in Heidegger. And that's what's quite interesting about working on a figure like Heidegger, is that you do learn to read by reading him. And I felt very steeped in it from the beginning, but I also, I think, like Dan, had a lot of trouble figuring out what was going on in the later Heidegger. And it's precisely the point to which Jean-Luc has directed our attention, these two ways in which Augustine comes back into the story in the later Heidegger that sort of opened up these very strange and very disturbing, very unnerving, I should say, texts in the later Heidegger on the issue of de-theologization. It made sense to me that Heidegger, as a young scholar, would turn to his tradition being that of Catholicism, having Heidegger was not only raised Catholic, but he studied very closely medieval Catholicism, and actually the first job to which he applied was a position in scholastic thought. So it made sense to me that he would rely upon what he knew well at a certain moment in his development. It's the fact that it seems to come back later on, that I didn't have a very clear view of what was going on there when I wrote the dissertation. And going from the dissertation to the book was an experience for me of trying to make sense of this second stage. And it's there that I found myself wrestling with the question of de-theologization. So very briefly, let me respond to the two questions that Dan posed at the end of his remarks. The one question being the objectivity of concepts, right? How do we think about that? Do concepts have their own entailments? Is there a surplus of meaning there? How do we make sense of the objectivity of concepts? And the other question being that of vindication. Heidegger is right. Dan suggests perhaps phenomenology is hermeneutic. And what does this tell us about the philosophy of religion? So let me say something about that, because my response to these two questions would be linked. The first is to say that I had trouble making sense of exactly what was going on in this study, because I felt like I was trying to study something that Heidegger himself was disavowing. He was hiding it. He didn't want it to be known, in some sense. Professor Marion Jean-Luc has told us about Jean Beaufrey early on. One didn't ask about the hermeneutics of facticity early on in Heidegger's scholarship. And now we have these texts. We have the entirety of the young Heidegger, the early Heidegger, at least up through Being and Time. And we can see how difficult this question is. That is, if there's a strategy on Heidegger's part. He wants to leave behind theology. He says in Being and Time that there are still remainders of theology in philosophical problematics, that's the way he puts it, and these need to be effaced or expunged, right? Extruded, erased for philosophy to be truly philosophical. That's on one hand. On the other hand, the claim is the way in which the strategy Heidegger uses to accomplish this task is to borrow in highly precise ways from the Christian theological tradition. From texts he says that phenomenology ought not to understand because it doesn't share the theological commitments of these texts. So how do we make sense of this? So I try to describe this in two ways in the book. The first way is to think about the structure, the way in which the concepts are structured in various contexts. And this gives you a sense of the entailments that are involved in with certain concepts. But structure is not enough. The other issue is that there's, as we pointed out, there's the perception that theological concepts have a kind of emancipatory force, that they can free you from certain problems inherent in the philosophical tradition. And it's this issue that really I find quite interesting, perhaps because these concepts are tied to the absolute for other reasons, but the very idea, perhaps, of emancipation, that is freedom, free thought, right? That is, rationality has to free itself from the tradition. It can't simply take up the tradition or traditions, that it has to emancipate itself, it has to free itself. That perhaps this very idea of emancipation tells us something about the relationship between theology and philosophy, And that the historically considered the relationship between theology and philosophy can tell us something about the concept of emancipation. Right? So that's my interest in the present. And so, to a certain degree, I do think that the book is a very small vindication of Heidegger on this level, in terms of thinking about the philosophy of religion. We've heard today the term the philosophy of religion, and yet the area in the Divinity School is called the philosophy of religions. And so what's at stake there in using the plural versus the singular? Dean Rosengarten pointed out that we can think of the philosophy of religion or the philosophy of religion as the work that gets done in the area in two ways. One, comparative work, right, to think about the relationship between traditions. The other way is to think about the relationship between historically considered philosophy and theology. It's that second task in the philosophy of religions area that I see myself as taking up. And I'm conscious of my limitations in terms of the first task in the area. But I think that my sense is that while on the one hand it's crucial for the philosophy of religions as an area to diversify. There was a blog post today in the New York Times about the Western and Eurocentric biases in philosophy departments. Right? And it's very important that philosophy as a field look at this critically. At the same time, I don't think we can be critical of our methods in the present unless we take a good hard look at the ways in which modern philosophy in the Western European context has always defined itself vis-a-vis some kind of construction of religion and or theology. So that's a small apologia defense for the idea of philosophy of religion in the singular, insofar as what we're taking to be religion is something in this context that philosophy defines itself against or alongside of in relation to in a certain way. So that's been my task thus far. It's my task in this book, and it's a task I hope to carry further in the book I'm finishing now and in some projects that I also have done. So let me say again, thank you very much to both of you. Thank you, Dean Rosengarten.
We have 5 or 6 minutes for questions and comments from the floor. I want to thank all of our speakers, especially Professor Coyne. The floor is open.
Thank you for the engagement and reflections. I have a question that I'm still forming, but you talk about the relationship between philosophy and theology and the way a philosopher like Heidegger, who is theologically rooted, engages theological categories and concepts. From your study of Heidegger in that vein and his engagement with Augustine, what does that portend or foreshadow for the way theologians may engage philosophy, particularly thinkers like Heidegger, in their philosophical work? Do you have any sense of how that relationship goes back and forth?
Thank you. That's a great question. To be very brief in response, I would say that the precondition for a theological engagement with a philosopher such as Heidegger would be to do this kind of critical work, to understand the ways in which these categories are functioning in the corpus. You know, when one of the crucial moments in the American reception of Heidegger was in the 60s when he was supposed to give a presentation at Drew University, and he didn't come because of doctor's orders. And Hans Jonas read his text and then followed up the text he had from Heidegger on the problem of the non-objective thinking in theology or in philosophy by saying, "Be careful." He's saying to a theological crowd, "Be careful. Christian theologians, what you make of Heidegger. You have in this context what looks like something that would be deeply familiar to you, something, a corpus from which you can borrow, but in fact, what has happened in Heidegger is that, this is Jonas's argument, that Heidegger brings together these pagan concepts with Christian theology, and so in fact you would be borrowing something that was deformed. So be very, very careful. I don't take that. I wouldn't take that position, but I would say that just to echo, I think what Jean-Luc said, that it's now really the first moment in which we're beginning to have the entire Heidegger, whereas we have all of the early texts. I handed in the final draft of the manuscript to the press a week before the first volume of the Black Notebooks, the so-called Black Notebooks that Heidegger kept from the early 30s to the early 70s, came out. And we will be getting more of these. There are a number of volumes that are already published. But it will be very important as a precondition for a theological engagement of Heidegger going forward that we do careful work on these categories in this text.
My question is probably best directed to Professor Marion. It's a simple one. Why do you suppose that the French have proven to be the most persistent readers of Heidegger?
First, I don't know whether the French deserve such a positive statement. What we could say is that as the French decided to take seriously Kant after being defeated by Prussia in 1870, the French decided to take German philosophy seriously after World War I. We won, but short escape, and at that moment there was some objective facts. Many people came to France which were educated in the German tradition, including Levinas, who played a crucial role, but there were many other projects. So, and the fact is that during World War II, the number of French intellectual academics who were reading Husserl and Heidegger in German, in the Lager and in Resistance is huge. There was Levinas, there was Ricoeur, there was Sartre when he was fortunately at that period serious, so he was still POW at the beginning. After that there was Ricoeur, there was Beaufray in the Resistance, Michel Henry. So it's amazing the number. So this was a real experience. All the French fighting against the Germans were studying German philosophy. That's simply a fact. So it was there was able at the same moment. And so after World War II, the turn was made, and the French were more German to some extent than the German in philosophy. And with this consequence that Heidegger was, even when I was in 68 student, Heidegger was a leftish intellectual in France. It's far left. So it was Heidegger and Marx was the same thing to some extent, speaking about philosophy bourgeoise and techniques. So that's the fact. And the other thing is that at the same moment Germany made the opposite turn. That is, after World War II, there was a suspicion about the political consequences of phenomenology and German idealism, both Nietzsche, Hegel on one side, and Heidegger on the other side, that many of the German philosophers decided to break with their own tradition, and they succeed. and this is succeeded. The best example of that, the best pattern being Habermas. So if you compare the school of Frankfurt School before the war and after the war, it's absolutely amazing, because before the war it was a Marxist, post-Hegelian school in a very classical tradition of critical philosophy in Germany. And after that, speculative one. Adorno is very speculative indeed. And it was, Adorno was doing a kind of Kant his way. It was in that kind. But after that, Adorno and Horkheimer and mostly Habermas had a complete sociological turn, made linguistic and sociological turn, putting them in line with analytic philosophy. And all the game was upset between France and Germany, and it is still the case now.
I'm sorry to have to say that it is 1:25, so we need to adjourn. But before you move, I think we should all take a moment to say thank you to Professor Marion and Arnold, and especially Professor Ryan Coyne. Thank you.